Okay, thank you for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to present the Petrels by Night project. In fact, this did not start just yesterday. This started 12 years ago, and it did not start with seabirds. It started with orchids. In 2012, I decided to travel to the island of Pico in the Azores and to look for the 3 endemic orchids that are flowering there. I wanted to photograph them. I had some information. I knew it would be tricky to find them because they're small, they're greenish, but I wanted to give it a try. And I asked a friend of mine, Paul de Wulf, birdwatcher and photographer, if he wanted to join me. So in June 2012, we left and we went to Pico. We picked up our rental car at the airport. We drove up on the plateau of the volcano. And at the first stop, within half an hour, we found the 3 species of orchids. During the preparation, I had been in touch with Justin Hart, an Englishman living at that time in the Azores on Pico Island. And Justin had told me, if you're around, give me a ring and I'll try to help you to find some birds. So I contacted him, and he didn't know anything about orchids, but he asked if we were interested to visit a colony of Corys shearwaters. Now, Paul and I had been doing seabird watching in Belgium quite a bit, and I had crossed the Atlantic already, seen Corys shearwaters, so yes, we were interested. And he told us to go there at night. So we went at night. We went in the evening first, and we saw the birds coming in, rafting, coming closer and closer to the shore, but not venturing on land. And then only when the night was completely dark, the birds started to come on land. They were in the air all around us. There were probably a few hundred. They were in the air. Corys shearwaters are big birds, on average 130 centimeters wingspan. They have quite huge hawk-like bills, and they were screaming in the air. We were really impressed. And we wanted to photograph this. But we were not equipped. We hadn't brought a flash. We didn't have a tripod. So the only option was to try to find a bird that had landed on the jeep track where we were standing, then slowly turn the car around, switch on the headlights in their lowest possible setting, and then lay on the ground and photograph the bird that was in front of us. And this is how this picture on the left was taken. Paul did it slightly differently. He sat on the ground, stabilized camera and lens on his knees, and that's the way he made the first pictures. Now, to give you an idea about the sound, this is what we heard. And if you hear many birds around you, this is really impressive. And the sound is part of that landscape, and it invades you. But of course, the idea was not to photograph sitting birds. We wanted to photograph flying birds. But how would we do that? We didn't have a clue. And once I came back home, the idea was still in my head, and I started to look around. I started to look for help. And quite rapidly, I understood that the people photographing bats probably had the same kind of challenges that we were facing. But you don't go to the bookshop and buy a book about how to photograph bats. There are only a few specialists, and they're not really wanting to share all their know-how. I wanted to study also better the birds, and I went the first time to the Isle of Skookum in Wales, where there are hundreds of thousands of Manx shearwaters breeding. Skookum is much closer to home than the Azores, and I wanted to have some first-hand experience with the birds. And there happened something that would be very decisive for the entire project. The wardens, Richard Brown and Giselle Eagle, were very enthusiastic about my ideas. And this was a time I could not show one picture. I just had a dream. I wanted to photograph flying seabirds, flying Manx shearwaters, maybe flying storm petrels. And they told me that they would give any help that was possible. They would give me access to the colony. They would show me the best places if I managed to sort out the technical issues. And it took me some time. And then I was showing some of my pictures during a nature photography festival in Belgium, and my neighbor was a Frenchman called Eric Médard, and Eric was a specialist of nocturnal infrared photography. There was the man who had the clue to my problem, key to my problem, sorry. He was presenting the results of 25 years of infrared nocturnal photography, but there was not one seabird in his book. So I said to Eric, well, why there is not a seabird? You have done everything from bears in the mountains up to small mice, flying bats, owls, whatever you can imagine. And he drew a little map of France showing the distance from his house to the coast, and then I understood why there were not seabirds. He was living hundreds of kilometers from the coast. And then grew the idea, after a few Belgian beers, to go together to Skookum the next spring. And that's what we did. It was a week of a lot of work. We worked 20 hours a day, setting up the cameras, preparing the equipment, sorting out technical issues. We had a lot of bad weather, a lot of rain. Circumstances were not easy, and we didn't really manage to make good pictures because we didn't understand the birds. And then we started working at night in shifts. Everyone was sleeping for 2 hours, and his colleague was standing or sitting with the equipment, supervising the equipment, and trying to understand what was happening. So it happened that at 3 a.m, I was sitting on a path, supervising Eric's equipment. We were trying to photograph storm petrels, but I saw one after the other Manx shearwater lifting off from the small path against the wind, just like aircraft are leaving an airfield. And in fact, these birds breed in burrows under the bracken, but they cannot get airborne in the bracken. So they scramble through the plants, come to the path, and then lift off against the wind. I explained to Eric what I had seen, and he decided to help me. And the next night, we put up the equipment in the middle of the path, and this is one of the first pictures we made. It was technically possible to photograph flying seabirds at night. And when I came home, I said, well, this is something I want to continue. I want to do this for all seabird species, tube noses, Prosalariformes of the West Palearctic. The project was born. Then I returned in twice to Skookum. First time was just the year after. Eric was busy with other projects, so I invited him, but he didn't have time. So I'm back to Paul, and Paul joined me, and we tried to photograph Manx shearwaters. But again, it proved to be very, very, very difficult. And we did realize that the flashes which we were using really disturbed the birds. So I went back to my friend Eric, and I said, well, I will need once more some help. What should we do to photograph with infrared? And he gave me some information. We modified 2 cameras, 2 standard DSLRs, and we went to Skookum. The only problem was that the cameras arrived the day before we left, so we didn't have any time to test something. And we arrived not exactly knowing what to do, and this was extremely difficult. We discovered that in infrared photography, nothing is like in standard photography. The wavelength of the infrared light is different, so you have to do focusing in a different way. The light you're using, we were using in those days 3 or 4 flashes, was way not enough. We needed more light. And again, we had bad luck with the weather. And then we went back to our friends Rich and Giselle, and yes, they helped us again. And they gave us access to the densest part of the colony, close to the lighthouse. There is a small path where the scientists go into the colony, and there we could work, and we made the first images. Then we thought we were ready for a more international approach. And I managed, with the help of Zoe Deakin in the UK, which I had met on Skookum, to go to Ilhéu da Praia. At that time of the year, storm petrels are breeding there, so it was an idea to start more work. This is the situation. The big island is Graciosa Island. The small rock in the foreground is Ilhéu da Praia, and on the left is Ilhéu da Baixa. And with some luck, we managed to make the very first nocturnal images of cool season band-drummed stone petrels, Grant's stone petrels. It was a learning curve. We had, again, very bad weather. We did realize once again that we still did not have enough flashlights. So this was learning. And it was a tricky thing because the weather was really bad. And I think the day we arrived on the island, we did realize that we would never get off on the date we had planned. So from the very beginning, we started rationing our food. And here you see Paul's breakfast, one of the last days. You see the huge quantity of foodstuff which is on the table, just a few cookies, the last box of cornflakes, and it was a very tough stay. And Paul decided after that he would leave the project. He would remain on as a technical advisor, but for the time being, he said, "Well, this is too tough. It took me 2 weeks to recover after Ilhéu da Praia, so I'll stay home." So I went alone to Sa Dragonera, Mallorca in April 2019 with the idea to try to photograph the Balearic shearwater, again, of course, at night. It was early in the season, the period that the birds are still incubating, which means that there is a changeover on the nest every 5, 6, 7 days. The first night I installed my equipment with the help of Ollie Paget from the Oxnav team. I heard the bird coming in, I saw a bird coming in, but nothing happened. 5 minutes later, the other bird, the partner of the bird, came out of the cave, disappeared into the night, and again, no flashes. Then I checked my equipment and something strange had happened, and there was no detection at all. But then I had a problem. I only had 7 days, sorry. So night after night, I was hoping the bird would come back early, but it lasted several days. And in the last but one night, I had this bird coming in. Here you see the bird on the left arriving, and on the right side, you see how I was preparing the setup. 1 week of nocturnal work for just one image, but the very first one of this kind of bird, of this species of bird at night. Then Paul and I returned to Skookum. Paul is a big fan of Skookum, just as I am. And we wanted to photograph young Manx shearwaters preparing for their first flight down from the UK, from Wales, to the coast of Brazil and Argentina, where they winter. And here you see two different techniques. Left is the standard technique with infrared flashes. In the meantime, we had upgraded our system and we were using 8 flashes, and that's just enough light. The advantage of that is we reduce the output of the light to 1/16 of the full power. Then the duration of a flash is only between 1/10,000 and 1/15,000 of a second. So you can really freeze the image. This bird is flapping its wings at a quite high speed, but you freeze the image. On the right side, you see a picture taken with infrared torches, which can be used to do some video. But the quantity of infrared light is much lower, so you cannot freeze the image as well. But it gives a nice idea about what happens with the wings. And the wardens, Rich and Giselle, challenged us. They wanted us to photograph their favorite bird, the European stone petrel. And they gave us the position of a nest in a wall. We just had to remove the little label with the number, promising we would put it back. And then we had the stone petrels coming in at night. And this is the sound of some stone petrels. And this purring in the nest can go on for hours. Then arrived 2020 and it's COVID. And I had planned to return to the Azores to do more work on the stone petrels and shearwaters, but I couldn't get there. The only option was to travel to Iceland. Iceland had a more relaxed policy about COVID. I had to do a quick COVID test upon arrival, and then once it was clear that I didn't have COVID, I could travel on to the Westman Islands, and I traveled to Heimei, and then a few days later with the team of Airport Hansen to Edley. And Edley holds the biggest colony of leech stone petrels in Europe. The only problem in summer in Iceland, there is no real night. So my infrared system didn't really work. Normally I use an exposure time of 20 to 30 seconds because I don't care. It's a black night and the exposure comes from the flashes. But here it was different. So I went back to my standard camera, and between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning, there was not really much light, certainly not in foggy circumstances like in this picture. But I worked at 204,800 ISO. And this gives really the atmosphere at night, and this is the song of the leech stone petrel. There are hundreds in the air over there. And the big challenge, of course, is to focus. So I had to pre-focus because the autofocus system cannot really pick up a bird when there is not sufficient light. So I had to pre-focus, and then I made something like 1,000 pictures every night and select just a few ones. Then finally, in July 2021, I made it back to the Azores, and I could try to photograph the endemic Montero stone petrel. Hydrobates monteroi has been described as a species only in 2008, and it was Jorge Montero who had the idea first that this was a different species because there is a population breeding in summer and a population breeding in winter. And in fact, he wanted to do the analysis of mercury pollution in the ocean. And instead of going out on the ocean and sampling water, he decided to use the stone petrels and to take blood samples and to define the mercury levels. Now, he found that systematically in the summer and winter population, the levels of mercury were totally different. So he concluded that these birds must go to different places to feed. And then gradually on, the idea came that these were really two different species. While my equipment was doing the work at night with the Montero stone petrels, I had time to go around the island, and Ilhéu da Praia is a very small rock. It takes about 7 minutes to go from the research hut to the top of the island and another 7 minutes to go down. So I had more than enough time to look for the place where the Cornish shearwaters were coming on land. Here they were again, in big numbers. And after a few nights, I managed to make this picture. Finally, after having started the project 9 years before, I managed to make the first nocturnal in-flight picture of a Cornish shearwater. And that night, I shared the image on my mobile phone with several friends who had started the project with me. You can imagine the happiness. Oops. Then in September of the same year, I had the possibility to travel to the Desertas Islands near Madeira. Target species there was a bird, a very special bird, breeding just here on this plateau at the top of the most southern part of Bugio Island. In fact, this is now a natural park, and the wardens have a permanent base camp somewhere over here on Deserta Grande. So I first traveled to Deserta Grande, where at that time the winter population of ground stone petrels were arriving. And this left image is quite special because this comes from the camera straight like this. It's not cropped. Two birds at the same time during a chasing flight. And during those chasing flights, they make a lot of noise. And the bird at the right, as you see, is singing. Now, the stay on Deserta Grande was, of course, interesting, but I wanted to travel further. And to travel further, we needed the small zodiac of the park, and the weather conditions were not really ideal. So day after day, night after night, I worked with the storm petrels, but we couldn't travel to Bugiu. And then I saw that the weather was improving. I asked the wardens if we would go, and they said, no, it's not possible because next night it's going to rain. Now, Deserta Grande, the desert, is not called Deserta Grande just by accident. When you land over there, you have the impression it never rains. So I thought that they were not really willing to go to Bugiu. At midnight, I was woken up and the rain was pouring down. So the weather forecast was really good. And the next day, the wind had picked up again, but they told me, take your gear, we're leaving, and we just have one night of work. You have just one night and you have to try. Now, Bugiu Island is not an easy place. It's not easy to land, and the colony is not near the coast. The colony is at the top of the land. It's 300 almost vertical meters of climbing, and it's the only colony in the world of the Desertas petrel. Now, luckily for me, the 3 wardens who accompanied me volunteered to help me carry the equipment, because walking or climbing up and down 300 meters with 50 kilos of equipment, it would not have been possible. The warden who stayed with me on the island, because the other 2 returned to Deserta Grande, Isamberto Silva, had something like 20 or 25 years of experience of going there to Bugiu. So he helped me to decide on which place I would put my equipment. And here you see the setup. So there are 2 tripods. Each is equipped with an infrared modified camera, 3 infrared or 3 or 4 infrared flashes, a triggering system. And here, this is just a folding meter. So what I do before I photograph a species, I check what is the wingspan, and then I pre-focus based on this. It's high-tech. This is high-tech. It's a LiDAR-based triggering system, and this is very low-tech, but it works. And then half an hour after the night fell, this picture, it was not a real surprise, because from the beginning of the night, I heard the birds, and this is a very special sound. So these are grand storm petrels you hear. And normally this more weak sound, you hear it at the beginning of the night and you hear it when the birds leave. But I was very lucky that night. There was activity almost during the entire night. And probably between 50 and 80% of the world population of between 300 and 500 birds was present around me. And then I wanted to travel to Cabo Verde. Cabo Verde is part of the Western Palearctic because it's part of Micronesia, and both botanically and for the birds, it's very similar to the species, or the groups and families are the same as on the Azores, on Madeira and the Canary Islands. But Cabo Verde has 5 endemic species of tube noses. Now, this would be a real challenge. If it would work, if I would be able to photograph the birds in Cabo Verde, I had a reasonable chance of succeeding the project. Failure, however, in Cabo Verde would probably have meant that it was not possible to finish the project. My first objective was another very tricky one, photographing Fea's petrel, Pterodroma fea, a close cousin to the Desertas petrel. Now, the place where they breed is very tricky. There are some nests here in the crater wall. This is a huge 9-kilometer diameter crater. And here I'm standing on the flanks of the big volcano, 2.8 kilometers high. The birds breed here, but they do their display flights outside of the crater. So everything for this bird is really tricky. But we had a place where we could listen to the birds, we could try to photograph them. And again, that very, very special sound. that vibrating sound, dark nights, a lot of wind, 8 nights just for a handful of pictures, but they were the very, very first of this species during their nocturnal flights. I was very happy once again. And then together with the team from Progetto Vito and Jacob Gonzalez Solis, I could visit Sima Island. Now, Sima is a very flat island between 5, 10, 15 meters high. This is the flat part of the island. And there is one rocky part. There is one big rock. And usually the scientists work behind there. So that's the only place in the island which is sheltered against the predominant northerly winds. And there I could work on more seabirds. First target species was endemic of Cabo Verde, is the Hydrobates jabe-jabe. Where does the scientific name comes from? Well, just listen to the sound. And at the end of each phrase, it's something like jabe-jabe, jabe-jabe. Jabe-jabe. Although this is a small bird, it was relatively easy to photograph, which cannot be said of the little shearwater. Puffinus boydii was the type specimen was collected here on Sima in 1897, and they breed there by the thousands. But they mostly breed in the flat area of the island, which is very, very tricky to work due to the heavy wind, because every day you have between 4, 7, and 9. There is sea spray all over the island. And in the colony behind that big rock, the number of Cape Verde little shearwaters is fairly low. But it worked. This is their sound, which was not recorded in the colony, but which was recorded near our base camp. And at 5 o'clock in the morning, when the hundreds of birds around the base camp were leaving, you couldn't sleep anymore. This was really spectacular. The most tricky bird, however, to photograph was the white-faced stone petrel, the southern species Eadesi. It's the most abundant breeder on Sima Islet, but nearly all of them breed in the flat area in the middle of the island. And just a few were breeding in more protected areas. So together with Jacob Gonzalez Solis, we tried to find 2 places, 3 places where I could potentially work without ruining my equipment. And it was up to me then afterwards to decide in which place I would try. So we put up the equipment in one place, moderately sheltered. We left the place, and then when the next morning we came back, discovered this kind of images on the cameras. Afterwards, that day, it took me the whole day to clean my equipment because the tripods were covered in reddish kind of mud, a mixture of seawater, salt, and dust. And then afterwards, when I came back at the hotel, I put my tripods just in the shower, and the water that came up was still red. Then I traveled to Croatia for some Mediterranean species, and the man who had invited me, Dries Engelen from NGO Biom, had sent me some great pictures. The Adriatic, blue water, nice sunshine. This looked a real nice place, a holiday destination. So I said to my friend Paul, well, this is a possibility to see some more birds, and on the main island there will be quite a few orchids. So he joined, and we went there. But when we came close to the island, we saw the island itself was certainly not a holiday destination. Moving around would be very, very difficult because it's just slabs of vertical rock covered with lichen, covered with bushes, and moving around was extremely tricky. So Paul never landed on the small island. But with the help of the biologist of the team and a few volunteers, I could bring up my equipment, and I stayed on the island every night, and the others left. And then again, I learned what the birds were doing. And before really night arrived, already the Scopolis shearwaters were arriving. They came to occupy their territories, and at the same time, the Ilkowan shearwaters were already well advanced in their breeding season. Now, Ilkowans are much smaller, so they didn't come in at the end of the day. They came in only in at night, and they left before daylight arrived. Now, how do they arrive? This is a completely different place for a relative of the Manx shearwater than Skookum. They arrive above the trees or bushes, they let themselves fall through the branches, arrive on the ground, and then scramble to their nests. Now, finding or photographing a bird in between the branches, I think it's not possible. But how do these birds leave? Because the same problem as between the bracken and Skookum, they cannot leave just through the branches. And in the morning, 5 in the morning, I saw one bird after the other leaving from one big rock, just like airplanes in an airfield from the runway. So the next night, I knew what to do. I knew that I had to put my triggering system a few meters away, and then I had one after the other birds. This is their sound, completely different from the sound of a Manx shearwater. The next destination the same year was St. Kilda. St. Kilda lies some 50 kilometers to the northwest of the Isle of Skye in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. It's in the middle of the North Atlantic. It's a very special place because it was inhabited till the early 1900s, and it holds leech storm petrels, European storm petrels, thousands of gannets, Manx shearwaters, and my idea was to try to photograph leech storm petrels. But St. Kilda is a very humid place, and that was one more challenge. I had gone through some tricky circumstances, but this was really difficult. And at the middle of the night, which is again very short, I had to clean the camera and lenses every 10-15 minutes because the humidity was just settling on the equipment. And I did not go to St. Kilda just by accident. I wanted to do something similar to this. In 1939, Robert Atkinson had the brilliant idea to try to photograph a flying leech storm petrel above a stone clade. At that time, he didn't go to St. Kilda. He went to an even more difficult place to reach, Sulasgare, but he managed to do that. You can imagine the difficulty at that time. No electronic flashes, no high-speed cameras. So it was a real challenge. And he came back, and this is here, the bird flying. 83 years later, I tried the same with modern high-tech equipment. And you see the kind of picture I was able to make. There are 4 storm petrels at the same time. This one, a second one, a third one, and in the background, a 4th one. Special places, fabulous people. We were there on the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, and I was there with a friend of mine, and we were invited to attend the small party organized by the Rangers and organized by the Rangers. And Will Boyd Wallace, who's working for the National Trust, had been there the year before, and Seabird Ranger Craig Nisbet had asked him if he wanted to sniff a storm petrel chick. Now, you probably know that storm petrels and storm petrel chicks smell like hell. They smell fishy like hell. And it had so impressed Will that he made a song out of it. And that's the song that I will play at the end of the presentation. Then in June of last year, I returned to Cabo Verde for the Expedition 2.0 because one species was still missing. That was the Calanectris edwardsi, the Cape Verde shearwater, because they breed not in spring or in winter like the other seabirds, but they breed in summer. But they breed in places which are very, very difficult to reach. And the colony in which Proyecto Vito works is on Brava Island, and you can only reach it from the sea if the sea is calm and if the wind is near to zero. And it's a tricky place. Landing is in the kind of cave. It's the only place where you can land because all the rest, there are just rocks. And it's a dangerous place because it's just at the bottom of vertical cliffs. We tried first time. We didn't make it because it was still too windy, and I think we would have lost boat and equipment and probably the entire crew. And then several days later, we tried again. And then the engine failed. The outboard engine stopped working. And while the skipper tried to start the engine again, I took the oars and tried to row the boat away to the safety, away from the land. But with this team, I think everything is possible. And this is a tribute to the teams that have worked with me, because what you see here is the result of one photographer. You hear one photographer presenting the images. But in reality, a lot of people have worked with me in the different places. These are students, volunteers, scientists, researchers, university professors, wardens, park directors, members of the military forces, policemen, you name it. They have hugely contributed to the success of this project. Thanks to everybody. So after I had rowed the boat back to safety, we had changed to another boat. We arrived, unfortunately, 1 hour too late at the colony, so I had to rush to install everything. And by the time I finally was ready, we heard the birds in the air. I switched on the 2 cameras, and seconds later, really seconds later, I saw a faint red light of the flashes. I checked the camera, and this was the image. And this is the sound. That night we only managed to make 1 picture, but of course the quality is wow. Then I returned to Cabo Verde in October, December 2023. The idea was to work on the endemic plants and take some time, if possible, to work on seabirds. This picture is again from the same volcano crater, 9 kilometers in diameter. And here you see the main volcano, Pico do Fogo. And you will remember that in these areas, there are petrels breeding. So I tried again. The Pterodroma fea, what they call the gon-gon. And for the first time ever, I used a thermal camera in that environment. And what we saw was something totally unexpected. We knew that these birds were doing chasing flights, but we had never seen, nobody had ever seen, that they were deliberately trying to touch each other. And the birds were not all over the place. They were only in a limited area of the airspace, what I have called a kind of courtship bubble. And I tried night after night to photograph them, but that did not work. Then this year, I spent several weeks on Selvagem Grande between Madeira and the Canary Islands. Selvagem Grande is a nature park, fully protected. There are no more predators, there are no cats, there are no rats, there are no mice, no more goats. So it's a real seabird paradise. It's the only place where Cory shearwaters come on land in daytime. And they breed there by the thousands. Not a few, just thousands of them. There are no predators. They don't fear humans. But for us, it's a quite dangerous place because these big birds, if you have an impact of a beak, well, it could have quite bad consequences. And I have seen the result of impacts. One flew into a flash box straight through the filter. My flash boxes were upturned, and so on and so on. I did not have any impact, but Warden Manuel Jose, who stayed with me most of the time, he had an impact. Luckily for him, it was a wing. And at night, even more Cornish shearwaters arrive at the nests. Another bird breeding over there is the white-faced storm petrel, but then the northern subspecies, Hippoloica. Frank Zeno had described them to me as swarms of mosquitoes. He said, switch on your headlamp and you will see them all around you. Well, I didn't switch on my headlamp. I used my thermal camera. And I think the result is even better than when you try to find them with your headlamp. There are thousands, really thousands, in a few colonies. And the number of pictures I made, and thanks to the help of Manuel José, who knew where the colonies were, we set up the equipment at the edge of the colony, not inside the colony, because they burrow their nest, they make their burrows in the sand. So it's, if you would go into the colony, you would just ruin nests. We set up the equipment on the edge of the colony, and even then we had many, many exposures night after night. Now here we have a problem with the video. And problem solved. So in Portuguese, these birds are called calcamar because they sort of jump on the water, but they do not only jump on the water, they also jump on the land. Except that normally speaking, you don't see this at night, and they're not making any sound when they fly. They're not making any sound on the nest. Well, they make some sound, but it's hardly audible. But here you have an idea what you can see with a thermal camera of this jumping. And then another species was the Madeira storm petrel, the real Hydrobates castro, the summer population. Now the tricky thing here is that this is an environment dominated by thousands of Cornish shearwaters, 130 centimeters wingspan. This bird is much smaller, 40 centimeters. Although they make quite a bit of noise, their noise is easily dwarfed by the sound of the Cornies. Now, it took me 3 nights to identify where a nest was, and then it's a matter of setting up the equipment and waiting. That's the result. Another bird breeding there, and in quite big numbers also, is the bulbous petrel, Bulweria bulweri. They're completely silent at night. They're completely silent in the air. They only make a lot of noise once they are in their nests. So they are quite difficult to detect when they are flying. And I have one short piece of video showing the number of these birds. So you don't hear anything, and whatever you hear is Cornish shearwaters or maybe storm petrels. But it's, as you see, it's quite easy to underestimate the number of these birds. And just the thermal camera allows to see the big number of birds in the air. And then the last story, Puffinus canariensis. It's probably the rarest tube nose of the West Palearctic. The subspecies was described in 2020, and today no active nests are known. We know that the birds are there. They breed on La Palma, they breed on Tenerife, they probably breed in Madeira, but it's high up in the mountains, in forested areas, and no nests have been found. I tried to find them first time in March 2021 on La Palma. I heard them night after night, but I didn't have a thermal camera in those days, so I didn't see one bird. Then in March last year, I went back to the same place with a team of the University of Barcelona. We were 16 people, 3 climbers from the Spanish Ministry of the Environment. We had 3 thermal cameras, a search dog. We did not find one nest. Would this image taken from a thermal camera video be the best that I would be able to make? It remained a challenge. So when I went back to Madeira this year, I remember that probably the birds breeding over there, the Manx she-otter is breeding over there, belong to this subspecies. So I started my trip at the Natural History Museum of Funchal in Madeira. And I photographed Puffinus canariensis, my usual style, but I was getting closer. And then I discussed with Frank Zeno and with Park Director João Nunes, Park Director of the Funchal Park. And the idea developed to try to find rafting birds. So when I came back after the Selvagens trip, I went out at sea in the evening on a sunset trip, discussed with the skipper. The skipper knew about patagarros, and I was extremely lucky to find them. These are just 2 images, but I was able to make the pictures. That's it. If you want to follow the project, well, you can have a look at my website, www.bartvercruysse.com, or scan the QR code and you're straight to it. You can also ask to receive the Petrels by Night project newsletter. If you send an email to this email address, or again, you will find it on the website. You can follow the expeditions direct live on Twitter. And of course, there will be the Petrels by Night book, but for this you will have to wait a few more years. Time to say not only thank you, as I did before, thank you to all the people who worked together with me to make this possible, but thank you also to say, thank you also to the different project partners. Well, thanks for listening. Enjoy your lunch, and we stop with the sound. There it comes, the Stormbird song, which I registered on St. Kilda, sitting alongside Will, just putting on the switch on my camera and recording. Thanks for listening. Muchas gracias.
Stormbird in my hand. The world unfolded in my hand. She took me dancing on the sea. She took me dancing and I broke free. Held a stormbird in my hand. The whole wide ocean in my hand. She took me dancing on the sea. She took me dancing and I broke free. songbird in my hand. Entire oceans in my hand. She took me dancing on the sea. She took me dancing and I broke free. She took me dancing and I broke free.